So we are back and ready to tackle the book of Revelation once again. If you are new, we took a brief hiatus from the book of Revelation to focus on Thanksgiving and Paul's letter to the church in Thessalonica. So I am ready, and I hope you are ready and are eager to learn once more to tackle this quite difficult book. To be specific, we'll focus this morning on the second vision that John saw in our passage in Revelation chapter 21. The first vision is the sight of the new heavens and the new earth, which, if we remember, is nothing less than the consummation of God's promise to end sin, decay, and death, thereby restoring creation back to its original state in the Garden of Eden, where there was no sin, no death, no murder, no rape, no racism, no tears, and ultimately no death. So that's the new creation. It's a restoration of creation. God makes this earth sinless without any subjection to the effects of sin, which is decay and death. The second vision in verse 2 is a sight of the New Jerusalem. This second vision is not a different vision that is unrelated to the first, but rather is the same vision that gives further clarification to the first. In other words, the second vision of a new Jerusalem further defines the first vision of a new creation. Then what is going on? What is it about the new Jerusalem that gives further clarification? I would suggest to you that the further clarification involves at least two insights. And here will be the two main ideas of this morning's sermon. Number one, the goal of the new creation is the new Jerusalem, which is the dwelling of God's presence. The goal of the new Jerusalem is, the goal of the new creation is the new Jerusalem, which is the dwelling of God's presence. And number two, the significance of the new Jerusalem is the intimacy of God dwelling with us. So the New Jerusalem, therefore, the title is the goal and the significance. When I first began to prepare this, I originally had three ideas. But when I was on my second point, it was already page 6. I usually keep it to page 5. So I don't want to keep it long. So I took one out. And maybe next week we'll focus on that point. So it's the goal and the significance of the New Jerusalem. So let's jump right into the first point. That is, the goal of the new creation is the New Jerusalem, which is clear in verse 2. Let's read, follow along silently. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, new creation. For the first heaven, the first earth passed away, and the sea is no longer, remember the sea here is representative of the demonic realm, the representative of sin. So that is no more, because there's a new creation. And I saw, verse 2, a new Jerusalem, which is the holy city coming down from heaven and from God, and was being prepared like a bride, having been adorned for her husband, namely Christ as the church. Christ as the husband to the church was the bride. I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the temple of God is among men. And He will dwell with them, and they will be His people, and God Himself will be with them as their God." Once again, in verse 1, John sees a new heavens and a new earth. In verse 2, John sees a new Jerusalem. In verse 3, John hears the interpretation of the new Jerusalem and the new creation. And what is the interpretation of that? The dwelling of God. In other words, the new creation sets up the new Jerusalem as its goal. So the sight of the new heavens and the new earth make way for the new Jerusalem, which is then interpreted with the sound of the temple of God, which is God's presence. The new creation, therefore, is not the final goal of God's purpose and plan, but rather the final goal of everything is the presence of God. I will be your God, you will be my people, and I will dwell among you. The Old Testament background reinforces the dwelling of God's presence as the ultimate goal of God's purpose and plans in all things. Leviticus chapter 26 bears the closest resemblance to our passage in vocabulary, where there the promise of God dwelling with His people functions as a blessing for those who obey God's covenant. So this is called a covenant blessing in Leviticus chapter 26. Verse 1, here we see what they call the covenant stipulations or the commandments of God. You shall not make idols for yourselves or erect an image or a pillar. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary, because I am the Lord. He is Yahweh. God's covenant stipulations are not isolated. They're not there in an island. God never expects us to obey a commandment that He does not give the resource or the provision for us to enable us to obey. What then is the basis for our obedience to God's commandments? What is the basis for the covenant stipulations? It's called the covenant prologue. In verse 13, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. In other words, we are to obey God because God creates us and because God saves us. That is always the basis for obedience. God always provides the means and the strength for obedience by His provisions. He never expects us to obey Him by our willpower, but God always provides. So I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Because of this, you shall have no other gods before me. Don't make idols. So the function of God's commandments, listen carefully, are to make public the private life of faith. Faith is grounded upon God's provisions in the past. Here it is the Exodus. He brought them out from the land of slavery, the land of Egypt. That God mightily delivered them and provides for their needs every day in the wilderness with manna and water and shelter. Now, to display the sufficiency of this covenant prologue, to show that God's provision is really good, is really satisfying, that what God has done in the covenant prologue is an A+, not a C-. God says, here are my covenant stipulations, the function of which is for us to express that God's provision is an A+. We don't need to improve it. It's not lackluster. There's no tweaking involved. God's provision is good. How do we show that? Obey. Obey. So if God really saves us and provides for our needs, then there's no need to make idols and worship them, because God alone saved us from the Egyptians and feeds us every day with manna, not these dumb idols. God did that. He provides for our needs. He saves us. He sustains us. There's no need to look elsewhere. We just look to God. He's the source and the supplier of everything I will ever need. So obey. If God really saves and provides for our needs, then we should rest. Not just physically, but rest spiritually, because God's provision is perfect. So that we do not need to work to improve it, because we think it's deficient, it's a C-, it's lackluster, it's lacking something, so I gotta work a little bit more to make it, to be more happy, to find more joy, to satisfy, because God's provision is really lacking. So don't work. Sabbath. To show that what God has provided is good. It's called the covenant stipulations. To make public the private life of faith. To show unbelievers that what God has done for His people is perfect, is good, so that His people obey Him. What happens if you don't? then we have what they call the covenant curses. In verse 15, if you spurn my statutes, my covenant stipulations, my commandments, and not do all my commandments, but break my covenant, then I will visit you with panic and wasting disease. God will kill them and ultimately exile them away from His presence. 587 BC, the Babylonians came and destroyed Judah, exiled them, destroyed the temple, separating Israel from God's presence. 722 BC, 200 years before that, the northern kingdom was destroyed by the Assyrians because Israel spurned God's commandments. Israel disobeyed God, and disobedience merits covenant curse. God will kill you, and He will exile you from His presence because you don't think God's provision is good. You think you can do better by yourself. You don't need God. I got to improve. And if you're trying to improve God's provisions, then you don't need God. Now, what happens if you obey? What if we obey God's commandments as a display of faith, not as a contest of my righteousness, but to show that God is good and His provisions are perfect? Leviticus 26, verse 11. I will make my dwelling among you, and my soul shall not abhor you or hate you, and I will walk among you, and I will be your God, and you shall be my what? People. What is the blessing for obedience? What is the covenant blessing? The presence of God. That's it. Not gold, not a Lexus, not a new house, not a retirement package, not stock options. God promises to those who are obedient and are faithful to Him, I will be your God, you will be my people, and I will dwell among you. That's it. And that's more than enough. Because by our obedience, we're showing that God's provision is good, that He satisfies, and nothing else. So our reward is fittingly Him, His presence in our lives. So this is called the covenant blessings. So the goal of the covenant prologue of God's provisions in the past and the covenant stipulations in the present is the covenant blessings in the future. Which means that the goal of our salvation in the past, which is a true exodus, is God's presence in the future. The goal of our obedience in the present is God's presence in the future. The goal of the new creation is to make way for the presence of God to dwell among His people, which is the ultimate covenant blessing in the future. So everything ends with God's glory dwelling among man. Though Israel suffered God's curse of exile, yet Ezekiel foresaw a day when God will reinstate His covenant blessing after He makes a new creation by delivering His people. In Ezekiel chapter 37, verse 26, and I'll make a covenant of peace with them. So God will make a new covenant with His people. Not that God will change the covenant, not that we no longer need to obey the covenant, not that we can have more gods now because it's so hard to obey that commandment. That's not what the new covenant means. The new covenant means it's the same covenant, but the locus of the covenant is no longer upon tablets of stone externally, but rather the locus of God's new covenant is in our hearts internally, so that we can obey. Because a lot of people think that the new covenant means I no longer need to obey. But rather, the new covenant is so that you can now obey. Because we will never grow tired of needing to display that God provides for our needs every single day. We always need to obey God's commandments. Always. Because it is the public display of our inward faith. So God will make a new commandment with them. It'll be an everlasting covenant with them, and I'll place them and multiply them, and I will set my dwelling in their midst forever. The covenant blessing. My dwelling place also shall be with them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And the nations will know that I am the Lord who sanctifies, who sets apart my people, who calls my people, and brings my people to myself, when my dwelling is in their midst forever. Here, Ezekiel makes abundantly clear that the goal of the new Exodus, the goal of the new creation, is the presence of God. The new creation, to be sure, is wonderful. No more tears. No more sin. No more death. No more rape. No more injustice. No more death. No more bills. No more mortgage. That's wonderful, right? Yeah. But that's a semicolon, it's not a period. It's a comma, not a period. It points to something even more wonderful. Because the new creation is just a step towards the grand goal. What is greater than no more sin, no more tears, no more bills? What is greater than that? The New Jerusalem, the presence of God. I will be your God. You will be my people, and I will dwell among you. So the absence of sin and death only serves to make way for an even more wonderful reality. That is God dwelling with man. You see, sin prevents God from dwelling with man. The whole of creation is corrupted with sin. God, therefore, will make a new creation without the corruption of sin. But the new creation is not the end. It is not the period. It's a comma. It only serves a greater, more glorious purpose. And that is, God will dwell with His people for all eternity. That is period. That's it. Nothing greater. Nothing more wonderful. What makes heaven great? It's not the streets made of gold. It's not your mansions. It's not your reward. But what makes heaven great is Jesus. His presence. Us dwelling with Him for all eternity. What is so significant about God dwelling with man? Why is that the end goal of everything? Why? The significance lies in the intimacy. That's the answer. The significance lies in the intimacy of the relationship that God so desires to have with His people. Which is why Revelation describes the new heavens and the new earth as a wedding. Because when God dwells with us, it will be a wedding. The closest, most intimate human relationship possible is marriage. And God designed marriage to point forward to a greater reality. And that is having intimacy with us. In verse 2, and I saw a new Jerusalem, which is the holy city, coming down from heaven and from God, and was being prepared like a bride, having been adorned for her husband. The closest parallel to our passage is in Isaiah chapter 61, verse 10. And they will rejoice with rejoicing in the Lord. Let my soul be glad in the Lord, for He has clothed me with the garment of salvation, with a tunic of joy. He has put on me a headdress as on a bridegroom, adorned me with ornaments like a bride. So the groom being prepared, Israel here is being prepared for the new Exodus. So the Exodus is thought of as a wedding. So get ready, Israel. Pack up your bags. The Lord will deliver you again. He will set you free from captivity, this time under the Babylonians. And that process of getting ready for this great day of salvation, the Lord uses the metaphor of a wedding. Because it's not just salvation for salvation's sake. It's salvation to have a close, intimate relationship with God, just like a wedding. We get married not for tax breaks. We get married not to have an Instagram, page that life goals realized. Family, kids, house, cars, life goals. It's not about that. We get married for intimacy, closeness, the feeling of love, codependency. That's why you get married. We get saved not so that we escape hell. God will make a new creation not so that there's just no more sin. We go to heaven not for the streets of gold. God's presence comes down and that's it. No. It's intimacy. Significantly here, John sees the bride not as ethnic Israel. The New Jerusalem is not Israel. The New Jerusalem is not in Palestine right now. Because John sees the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven. Unless, if you take that literal, unless you think Jesus picks up Palestine right now and brings it back like a spaceship from heaven. That's not it. John is merely saying that the New Jerusalem is God's presence. God is coming down to be with His people. That's what it means. That's all it means. God will dwell with His people. And the act of God coming down is described in terms of a marriage. Those who marry Christ are not those who are ethnic Jews only. So marriage to Christ is not dependent upon our ethnicity. But rather, according to verses 6 and 7, those who are married to Christ are those who overcome and those who thirst after Jesus, irregardless of your ethnicity. So in verse 6, and he said to me, they have been realized, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. I myself will give to the ones thirsting the fountain of living waters. That's the first condition. Who is part of this new Jerusalem? The ones who thirst, who desires after Jesus. And verse 7, the ones overcoming, irregardless of your ethnicity, will inherit these things, and I will be a God to them, and he shall be to me a son. So what is the New Jerusalem comprised of? The church. Anyone, whether Jew or Greek or slave or free or male or female, if you trust in Jesus, then God will dwell with you. The apostle establishes the grand purpose for love and intimacy in human marriage in Ephesians chapter 5. One of the mind-blowing passages in the whole Scripture. And I bet you when Paul wrote this, his mind was blown too. Here in verse 31. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Quoting Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, when Adam and Eve had sexual relations. That's what he's quoting. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. And he says this mystery is crazy. This mystery is profound. And what is that mystery? And I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. Listen, Paul says. When Adam and Eve, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, consummated their marriage, Moses was not talking about Adam and Eve. Moses was talking about you and Jesus. This mystery is profound. Because the purpose of a human marriage is to give us a glimpse of God's love. and patience and kindness and intimacy with his people, so that this human marriage serves a limited purpose to show us God's love for us. So that's why Paul has the confidence to reinterpret it. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, and says, no, he's not talking about Adam and Eve, he's talking about you and Jesus. Because that's how close our relationship is with the Lord. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself. Intimacy. And let the wife see that she respects her husband. The book of Revelation reaffirms the teaching on human marriage as a glimpse of the future and true marriage between Christ and the church. Revelation chapter 19, verse 7. Let us rejoice and be glad and give glory to him, for the marriage supper of the Lamb has come. The church and Jesus and his bride has made herself ready. The reason why sex is so powerful, the reason why there's great intimacy within sexual relations, is because God designed it to give us a glimpse of his intense desire for us. That is why sex outside of marriage deeply offends God. The two most heinous sins in the Bible is idolatry and sexual immorality, and the two are interrelated. Sex is supposed to seal the commitment, the faithfulness, the love, the devotion, the kindness, and the meekness within marriage. Yet people use sex for the mere momentary lustful pleasure, using God's gift, abusing it, and distorting it, slapping God in his face. But that's what sin does. We use God's gift and we distort it. Nevertheless, the point is clear. God's presence dwelling with us signifies intimacy in the highest possible form. A wedding between Christ and the church. The goal of the new creation is the dwelling of God's presence. Point number 1. Point number 2. The significance of God's presence is intimacy with his people. Let us conclude with the following challenge. Because the goal of the new creation is the dwelling of God's presence, let us therefore make the glory of God's presence in our lives the ultimate goal for living. Let's be honest, what's really our goal? What really wakes us up in the morning? What really drives us to work? Is it a good job, marriage, kids, early retirement, buy a home, pay off a mortgage, pay off your car? Even the good things, like a new creation, that's not the goal. Even salvation, that's not the goal. Even escaping wrath, that's not the goal. Even sinlessness, that's not the goal. The goal is God's presence. All those things are commas and semicolons. All those things end with an arrow pointing upward to God. That's the goal. Is the goal of your life to treasure the glory of God's presence now? So that when the glory of God's presence come in the future, you will not feel ripped off. Right? Because if that's not really what you wanted, then why do I get God? If you're going to feel ripped off. Lord, I really wanted a six-pack, not really your presence. Lord, I really wanted to have a home in the, mountains of Malibu overlooking the ocean, not your presence. I mean, yeah, it's nice, but I would have really liked, What's the goal? It's not even sinlessness. Can you imagine that? It's God. And second point, because the significance of God's presence is His desire for intimacy with us. Let us therefore seek intimacy with God by spending time alone with God in prayer and in scripture reading with no distractions, no time considerations, no time pressure. How do you do this? I must confess, I struggle to have intimacy with God. I got paid to pray, right? It's part of my job descriptions. You guys can fire me if I don't pray. I get paid to read the Bible and to study the Bible. So if I'm not doing my job, you guys can take a vote. Seriously, as a Southern Baptist, you guys can take a vote and fire me if I don't do my job. It's my job. But how do we make it so that it's not clocking in and clocking out? I remember in my Old Testament theology class, Dr. Bullock said that, the Bible speaks to us, but the Psalm speaks for us. It's right in the middle of the Bible. And I think that's intentional. You can't support this biblically. It's right there because it's the very heart of the Bible. Because the Psalm speaks for us. And I want to challenge you that if you're having a tough time having intimacy with the Lord, read the Psalms. For instance, Psalm 18, verse 1. I love you, O Lord. You are my strength. The Lord is my rock. The Lord is my fortress and my deliverer, my God. In whom do I take refuge? And shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. I am saved from my enemies. Psalm 23, a very famous one, right? The Lord is my, I shall not. You know what that means? Because God is my shepherd and I am the sheep. I do not want anything because He provides for everything I need. I don't want nothing or anything. That's bad grammar. I don't want anything, Lord, except You. The Lord is my shepherd and I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. Basically saying, He provides me with everything that's good. Because a sheep, they will look for pastures and it'll be brown because they think they know better. They're going to try to look for food and it'll be dirt. So they need a shepherd to lead them to the green pastures because the shepherd knows where they are. So he leads his sheep. That's what that means. He leads me beside the still waters. Because sheep, they would just go and they would look for water and they'd be lost in the desert. They would die of thirst. But the Lord knows where the waters are. So He leads us to the still and the calm and the satisfying waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. And verse 4, every time I read it, I think of Coolio. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. You guys know the song, right? Gangster Paradise. I fear no evil, for You are with me. He ruined that song for me. That's this song for me. Your rod and Your staff, they comfort me. God's discipline comforts His people. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. I'm satisfied in You, Lord. I'm more than satisfied. It's spilling over. Everything You've done for me is more than enough. There's an embarrassment of riches of God's grace is bestowed upon my life. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord, dwelling of God's presence. Remember, that's the goal of everything. Forever. Psalm 63 verse 1. And there are many, just giving you some Psalms so that we can get intimate with the Lord now. Oh God, you are my God. I shall seek you earnestly. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh yearns for you in a dry and a weary land where there is no water. Thus I have seen you in the sanctuary to see your power and your glory, because your loving kindness is better than life. My lips shall praise you. Wow. Your mercies and your kindness, Lord, they're better than life itself. My soul is satisfied with marrow and fatness, and my mouth offers praises with joyful lips. When I remember you on my bed, I meditate on you in the night watches. For you have been my help. And in the shadows of your wings, I sing for joy. My soul clings to you, Lord. Your right hand upholds me. Wow. Now you can see why the Bible calls David a man after God's heart. Intimate with the Lord. Close with the Lord.
The Lord of the oceans. My little bark sails on a restless sea. Grant that Jesus may sit at the helm and steer me safely. Suffer no adverse currents to divert my heavenward course. Let not my faith be wrecked amid storms and shoals. Bring me to harbor with flying pennants, hull and breach, cargo unspoiled. The voyage is long, the waves high, the storms pitiless. But my helm is held steady, your word secures safe passage. Your grace leads me onward. My haven is guaranteed. And this is my favorite part. Help me. Protect me.